Welcome to another edition of Off Air. It's the new TV chat show from Talk Radio where I, Mike Graham, interview some very interesting people about some very interesting things. Today, I'm delighted to say we've got Dr. Paul Stott from the Henry Jackson Society joining us to talk about, amongst other things, Islamic extremism and what to do about it. Dr. Paul, welcome to Off Air.
Good afternoon, Mike.
Thank you very much for joining us. Now, you come to this show at a quite prescient time, really, because we're in the midst of still the aftermath of the Streatham incident, which I suppose a lot of people have already forgotten about because it was over a week ago. But we've also got upcoming, it seems to me, a whole raft of extremists who are due to be released, which the government is definitely now trying to stop happening.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it worries me when we almost become accepting of terrorist violence, that we just accept that that's the norm and it's there in the backdrop. And I think there has been an element of that, certainly post Streatham. The government's in a difficult position. If you think in terms of responding to terrorism, there was an old argument. There was a terrorism studies academic, Paul Wilkinson, and he used to argue that it's very important in responding to terrorism not to do too much. You don't want to go out and shoot 10,000 people, right. But equally, it's important not to do too little. And I think the government has got itself into a historical problem where we've perhaps been doing too little, certainly with regards to sentencing. And so we've had cases where people being automatically released at the halfway point of their sentence. We saw with Usman Khan, the London Bridge attacker, he was able to pull the wool over the eyes of the authorities.
Yeah, they all thought he was on the mend and he wasn't radicalised anymore.
Indeed, and unfortunately, it was a deadly mistake.
Yeah.
With regards to Streatham, that seems to have been the exact opposite case. That the authorities knew full well that the individual concerned was still dangerous. I think within 3 or 4 days of his release from prison, the plainclothes police were following him around, monitoring him, and despite that, he was able to launch not a very sophisticated attack, but clearly one where he realised the authorities were onto him. He's driven by this anger. He's going to try and do something. So the government really has to look at how we, first of all, stop the release of people who are a potential danger. So that's why we've had these proposals from the Justice Secretary.
Yes. Well, you were one of those people, I think, as well, involved in the Streatham case, were you not? Where you told them that this guy should not be released, and yet they didn't seem capable of stopping that. And thank goodness the police were as good at their jobs as they were.
Yes, I think the authorities, unfortunately, now have got a lot of experience in terms of monitoring and responding to these sort of roving type attacks. We've seen it twice now at London Bridge, seen it in Manchester, seen it with Streatham. The type of advice the Henry Jackson Society was, or the position we were trying to put forward, is one that I think some people had noticed way back in 2018, that for various reasons there was a sort of quirk in the system coming up, that there was going to be a lot of terrorists who were due for release. And with hindsight, there was probably a little bit too much focus given on those who'd gone out to Syria, gone out to Iraq, and not enough on how safe is it to actually release some of these individuals. And in some cases, there were people, I think Usman Khan was a classic example of this, who would have wanted to go and join Islamic State, but weren't able to because they'd been arrested previously for other offences. Yeah. And so, if you like, they're up for it.
Because we've also, at the moment as well, of course, got the trial going on at the Old Bailey of the Manchester bomber's brother, and that was another case really where, and I know it was probably a much longer time ago than what we're talking about now, but it was another case of things sort of slipping through the cracks and yes, the authorities knowing that they should be watching these guys, but then kind of not watching them.
Yes, if you look at Salman Abedi, the suicide bomber in Manchester, he'd moved around a particular circle of individuals who were certainly known to the authorities in that sort of South Manchester area around the university sector. He'd also been back and forth to Libya, and indeed had a family background in his father had been involved with the Libyan Islamic fighting group. And they were one of the sort of opposition groups to Gaddafi. Right. Somewhat unfortunately, we gave the family asylum.
Well, because we thought they were the good guys, right? I mean, that was the sort of David Cameron-inspired era of massive proportions, wasn't it?
Well, we'll see what happens post the Abedi brother trial as to whether this issue will come back on the horizon. But I'm afraid there are questions to answer with regards to our position on Libya. But just going back to Salman Abedi himself, I mean, he was able, for example, to visit convicted terrorists in prison in the northwest of England. So you've got somebody who's seemingly down this path towards radicalisation himself, and the prison doors are thrown open for him to come in and sort of have a chat.
This seems to me to be the fundamental problem with dealing with these individuals, these extremists, because the justice system and even the police, in a way, seem to treat them as if they're regular criminals, and they're really not. And I've been arguing now since probably about 2 weeks ago, maybe before that we really should be treating these people differently. Should we not be putting them in a special category? They're not just criminals. They're not just, secondary members of the prison population. They should be kept well away from each other and well away from anybody else.
Well, I think you have to ask yourself what motivates offending, what motivates people to go out and do things and to break the law. And I think with terrorist offenders, it's much more likely to be rooted in ideology, belief, or certainly justified through ideology and belief, than somebody who's going out stealing cars for the fun of it, or
just to make money.
Or who's fiddling the benefit system or whatever for their own personal gain. One of the ways, I think, to look at terrorism is what criminologists would call altruistic behaviour. It's to benefit others, it's to benefit a cause or benefit a group of people, as you see it. So we therefore have to look at offenders of that type, I think, very, very differently, because beliefs, particularly if they're religious beliefs or politico-religious beliefs, they may well endure over a very long period of time. And although we see some big claims sometimes for these sorts of counter-radicalisation programmes, I'm not sure there's an enormous amount of clear data out there. And even if there is, it's very difficult to establish if somebody, is in prison, been convicted of a terrorist offence, they come out, they don't go back to offending. Is it because of the intervention we've made, or is it just that person's tired and they're going to go and do something else?
Is it something, for example, as far as you've studied, that they grow out of at some point? Because there seems to me as well to be a very similar pattern for an awful lot of these young men who have got parents that probably came here from another country. They're almost certainly Muslim, or on very odd occasions they're converted to Islam. They're almost certainly sort of in some way detached from society. They haven't done well at school. Their education hasn't been particularly good. They've quite often fallen into petty crime and possibly marijuana use and maybe other drug use. There's quite a similarity between an awful lot of them.
There is and there isn't. I mean, all of those component points that you pick out, you will find in some cases. But you could equally look at some of the Britons who went out to Syria. There's been people from successful backgrounds in law. There was a barrister from Birmingham, who was a very high-profile case, a doctor from Sheffield, people who were already extremely successful, but who are still looking for something and are going out and attaching themselves to a cause like Islamic State or Al Qaeda. If you look at some of the data, some of the other European countries, there's probably a bit more than there is here of that sort of gangster jihad type element. So it's particularly prevalent in Germany. I think over 60% of the Germans who went out to Syria had prior criminal convictions. In Britain, I think it's around about 48% or so. So that element's there, but one of the odd things with sort of British jihadism is its diversity in terms of the background. So other than the fact that obviously it's a Sunni Muslim club, to join, people from a whole range of backgrounds will be there. Probably if you're looking at a common denominator though, you're talking about age. These guys are much more likely to be younger than older, people of fighting age. And when we look very often at some of the older people or some of the women to go out there, they're in different roles. They're doing different things. Right. And that's probably quite common with other terrorist groups, with other radical organisations. The types of things Jerry Adams was doing in the IRA and his early 20s were very different to what he's doing.
Yes. The thing about Gerry Adams, though, was that he had a very ripe sort of economy and community that he could exploit that was right on his doorstep, rather than actually telling people, come over here and fight in this, imaginary war that you can't really imagine until you get there, and you can tell people almost anything. I mean, he was able to kind of radicalise, I suppose, Republicans in Northern Ireland, and maybe in the Republic as well, to fight the cause of the IRA, because he could show them what the British were doing.
Yes, and in a way, if you look at the appeal of Islamic State and how ISIS, in some ways, was able to gain greater appeal in this country than Al Qaeda had, or any of the the small Pakistani jihadist groups. The beauty of their message, in a way, was that type of clarity. Here is actually existing Sharia. Right. Here is, we have proclaimed the Islamic State. Right. It is the duty of Muslims to come here and join it.
So you can come here and join it, live in that way, and also defend it, I suppose, and also expand it.
Yeah. So here, if you like, is what all Muslims should be striving for. And even if people weren't able to always travel to it, those who didn't but who were supportive of the cause, there was also a message for them of fight jihad in the countries that you're in. And so we see, particularly from sort of 2014, 2015 onwards, this whole series of attacks in different European countries, starting in Belgium, France, and then eventually reaching us here in the UK with 2017 was a bad year.
And for the moment, I mean, despite what happened in Streatham and despite London Bridge last November, it doesn't feel as though we're on the brink of another sort of Bataclan. I think a lot of people, when they saw Bataclan happening, were very concerned that was terrifying. The idea of somebody running at you with a knife, we can all kind of, I guess, in some way contemplate and figure out what you would do. What you can't do is imagine, as I did, and I think a lot of people did, the very next week after Bataclan happened, that, what are you going to do if you go down to the underground one day and there's a bloke with a machine gun just shooting people at random? And it's almost impossible to defend.
Yes, it's one of the areas where we're slightly luckier in the UK than perhaps some of the countries on the continent. That I get all the libertarian arguments in favour of gun ownership, but the reality is we're a lot safer in this country because there isn't the same amount of guns in circulation, and it seems harder for them to get into the hands of some of the jihadists than it is in France, Belgium, etc., etc. I think with the Bataclan and the whole sort of Paris attacks, November 2015, that was centrally directed from Islamic State territory, and people were able to travel all the way from Syria through Turkey into Greece, up into Belgium and France, and then to carry out the attacks. And they did so pretty much without even having a passport check.
Which also brings us back to that town in Belgium where they all came from, which was apparently effectively a no-go zone for the police. Nobody went there. It was more or less run by sort of extremist Muslims, effectively. There were other Muslims who lived there who weren't extremists, but they were more or less free to do whatever they wanted and cross the border into France whenever they wanted.
Yeah, and we'd had, if you like, a warning a little bit earlier. There was an attempted gun massacre on a train where somebody had boarded, I think in Belgium, got into France, opened fire and was overpowered. And so, yes, nobody wants on continental Europe the hassle of border checks all the time and whatever as people cross between Belgium, France, Germany, Switzerland, whatever. But without those borders, we have to remember there are always going to be people who are going to take advantage of them.
Yes, and I guess that's where it brings us back to someone like Shamima Begum. It brings us back to the whole business of leaving the European Union as well, and whether anything's really going to change now that we've got our own supposed control of our own borders, because I'm not sure that we have changed anything yet.
Well, in terms of counter-terrorism, a lot of the issues are actually internal as well as external. That we have a small minority within British Sunni Islam who hold extreme views, who will propagate those views, and actually going way back into the 1990s, have pretty much a small number have pretty much joined virtually any area, any struggle anywhere in the world where people have picked up the gun. Right. So from the Bosnian Mujahideen in the early 90s, Kashmir in the late 90s, people from Lancashire who were killed fighting for the Taliban in the late 1990s. In a way, none of this is new. And we have to face the reality that therefore it's going to be with us for for some time to come.
Yes, and I suppose the Islamic State and the sort of the progress that it has made, supposedly coming from nowhere, then perhaps being defeated by the Americans. Where is it now, as far as you're aware?
Well, in a way, IS now reverts back to the traditional role of terrorist groups, which in some ways is a tricky one for the authorities to handle. That the authorities have to make the areas previously controlled by Islamic State secure. They then have to provide the services, the functions that society needs, from good law and order through to the sewers working. And groups like Islamic State can then emerge at night and harry the government's forces in Syria, Iraq, or wherever. I think the advantage for the UK from what's from the Americans and the Kurds as well, don't forget, who probably did the lion's share of the fighting against Islamic State. But the advantage of that conflict is, of course, that so many British jihadis have been killed, so they won't be coming back. But Islamic State lacks now the territory from which to plan, control and train for attacks in the West. That's what the Taliban gave Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan in the late 90s. That's what Islamic State was able to give some of the jihadists from Western Europe who'd settled there in that period, 2015 to 2017, and it's from there you get these attacks going in.
And what about the money and the funding? Because one of the things that I think we were certainly told was that they plundered quite a lot of Iraqi gold, Iraqi money. They basically broke into banks in parts of Iraq and just took everything. I mean, are they still quite well funded, or is that all gone now?
The Iraqi army pretty much disgraced itself, and as you say, whole towns fell incredibly quickly, including the bank vaults. So where that money now is, where it's been distributed to, is one of the questions, because you have little pockets of Islamic State support in different parts of the world. We were talking about Libya earlier. Libya was certainly one. Pockets in West Africa, Niger, Mali. Also, territory was proclaimed. Groups pledged allegiance to IS in Afghanistan and even briefly in Pakistan. I think, though, the money issue is perhaps less of an issue with this stripe of terrorism, certainly here in the UK, than other stripes, because when you look at some of the attacks that occur, they're pretty low budget. And so, a vehicular attack like the 2017 London Bridge attack, for example, all that's cost them is the cost of hiring a van, the petrol for the van, the knives they used, whatever they used to make the fake suicide vests, and that's it. Right. So, somebody's own bank account can cover that pretty easily. We'll see what further comes out from the Manchester Arena case, but even going back to the 7/7 bombing, the individuals there, it didn't seem to have cost. There was estimates at the time around about £8,000, for example, the cost of that. Well, people can get that type of money.
Of course. And Shamima Begum herself, she's failed at the first hurdle of trying to get her citizenship reinstated. She's going to appeal. There does seem to be still in this country, and it's been proven over the course of the last couple of weeks as well, that there's a group of lawyers who will fight any government to the death, effectively, that these people should have the same human rights as everybody else. And that's where it starts to get a bit tricky, doesn't it?
Well, in a liberal democracy, you expect that, and it's probably healthier that it should happen. The difficulty is that I think with perhaps some of those lawyers, but more particularly some of the politicians who advocate those types of positions, it's power without responsibility.
Yeah. It is.
They're all looking at their feet when the actual attack happens. So I think the new Labour MP in Streatham had tweeted out in the election campaign, her opposition to government counter-radicalisation programmes. Here she has a terrorist attack on her doorstep.
Yeah, she blamed it on the police station being shut, which was probably slightly naive.
Well, I don't think the police could have done much more in the case of Streatham, really. But in the particular case of Shamima Begum, there are some real problems, I think, there. If you remember when the 3 young women from Bethnal Green went out, there was a real sort of press furore, and I think somebody else from their school had gone out already. There was a suggestion that I think a woman from Scotland had been in contact with the first young woman to go out, but the police were put on a sort of back foot there, and it was Hogan Howe who was the police commissioner
Yeah.
at the time, and he did take, I think, this extraordinary position of declaring that if the 3 girls came back, they wouldn't be prosecuted. And that was taken by their lawyer as a sort of, a serious position.
Yeah.
I don't think that did anything to deter other young
No.
women or young people from
Well, no,
going out.
because the narrative that the people like Hogan Howe were kind of painting was it was almost like they were going on a sort of junior year abroad, that they were actually educating themselves about something as opposed to actually going to take part in a terrorist action with a prescribed group.
They were also going out after we'd been aware of the most awful murders of hostages that Islamic State had taken, including charity workers from the UK, the kidnapping of journalists from the UK, and the genocide against the Yazidis. And I think one of the things which concerns me going forward is if you compare the crimes of Islamic State and our response and the international community's response to them with the crimes of the Nazis and the response, there was this vigour and vim post-World War II to have the UN War Crimes Commission, to deal with people, to prosecute. I think if we turn around tomorrow and said, we're going to prosecute 500 British Muslims for going out, joining Islamic State, going out to Syria, Somalia, Afghanistan or wherever, I think some people would have a nervous breakdown.
I'm sure they would. But by the same token, surely it's something like that is actually required, because we've got about 400 of these people who have already come back to Britain, as far as we're aware. Shamima Begum may not be one of those that gets to join in, but you'd have to say to the government, well, how come you let all these other people in and you're not letting her in?
Yeah. It should have been obvious long ago that these individuals did pose a potential terrorist threat. There was a case, a guy was arrested back in 2014, a guy called Tariq Hassan from London, who'd gone out initially to Africa to train as a doctor, had then gone to Syria, joined Islamic State, had come back to the UK and was arrested for allegedly plotting a terrorist attack here. On Twitter, trending one evening was Justice for Tariq, and that was the campaign, to argue that he'd been wrongfully arrested. He'd said things on social media that were about girls that had been misinterpreted.
Right.
I think he'd said something about, ready for war or whatever. And of course, he was tried, he was convicted, he'd been plotting trying to get hold of a gun in order to carry out an attack on off-duty soldiers in London. So it should really have been obvious, most certainly from that point, that there is a real threat here.
Well, you would have thought so. This is the same mentality as well that has people siding with these criminals that the government wants to deport back to Jamaica because they're criminals. And everyone's going, well, hang on a second, they haven't lived there for a long time, and some of the crimes they've committed haven't been that bad. And you go, well, why would you be making that case? I'm sorry. If they have to be sent back to the country from which they came, albeit many, many years ago, what's the problem with that?
The hardest thing sometimes is to say no. Because the danger is that because everything's become so racialised, it's so about group identities rather than about the individual, rather about the citizen or the subject, whatever you want to define your nationality in Britain as. But because everything's about these group identities, it becomes almost an attack on one person. Oh, well, that's an attack on all Muslims, or that's an attack on the whole community. Well, actually, we were told that Shamima Begum wasn't representative of her community.
Yes, exactly right. And that's what leads, I think, to the difficulties that communities have had, because you talk about it being a top-down kind of a problem, if you like. There's lots of areas of this country where there is hardly any diversity whatsoever. And I have these arguments with people all the time, in one way or another, either on the phone or on the show or on Twitter, where there are people, on the other hand, who live in areas which are incredibly diverse and which have got an awful lot of Muslims who have moved in, or an awful lot of Eastern Europeans who have moved in. And the government, I think, has to be careful about the way that it deals with all of this, because what it has done, I think, in a lot of areas, and I know they're in a minority, is it has kind of encouraged people to be racist. And not because they necessarily perhaps would always be racist, but because they look and point at things and say, well, look at the Pakistani grooming gangs. Why didn't anybody do anything about that? Oh, it's because the government and the police and the social workers didn't want to offend anybody. Well, that's not good enough anymore, is it?
No, and I think certainly from politicians, from government, from intellectuals, academics, there needs to be some sort of vision, common narrative of what we are, where we're going,
right?
And that's been sadly lacking.
And what you can say, and what you should say, and what you should do.
Yeah, and I think freedom of speech is an absolute fundamental. And one of the things that concerns me is that we focus on groups like Islamic State, Al Qaeda, the Britons who support those groups, and then at the same time we potentially either ignore or we end up working with people with very similar views, but who don't personally use violence, or who step away from the type of violence that jihadist groups activate, but who are actually, in their long-term vision, looking to create a very similar society.
Yeah.
And some of the debates around Islamophobia really worry me for that reason.
Yes.
Yes, there is something that we could call anti-Muslim prejudice. It needs to be fought, it needs to be acted against robustly. But the idea that we could have legislation, laws, policies against criticism of a religion is a nonsense.
Yes, it is a nonsense. And there was a case, was there not, just over the weekend in the Sunday Times, of a guy who's working for the government, but who has apparently been saying things like it's not right to criticise Islam. And therefore, anyone who does it should in some way be sanctioned.
Yeah, I mean, what are we going to do? Are we going to apply those laws to the people who made the life of Brian?
Yeah.
Because they've offended Christians? Right. One of the big problems, one of the shifts that's occurred in recent decades, and I think it's been influential right across government and all levels of the civil service and indeed all of our main political parties, is we seem to have accepted a worldview or an approach towards issues like racism and discrimination, where instead of wanting to treat everybody the same, because that was the big argument in the 1980s, was for equality.
Yes.
We seem almost without pausing breath to accept arguments where actually we want difference.
Well,
we want to be treated differently, and you're discriminating against us if you don't allow us to be treated differently.
I mean, one of the great dichotomies for the left, you'll remember last year that school in Birmingham, where inside the school they wanted to teach LGBT values, as they called them, whatever that is, to the kids about relationships and same-sex relationships and all of that. And meanwhile, the Muslim objection to that in the community, which was not, again, all Muslims, but was sort of created a big sort of standoff between some agitators from the Muslim community who weren't even part of the school, and the LGBT campaigners. And the left didn't know where to go. They didn't know who to back, and they all kind of ran away in the end because they weren't quite sure, which side they were on. Yeah.
Well, again, it's going back to that response I mentioned earlier of looking at your feet.
Yeah.
This is the too difficult box. These are the questions that are too difficult to handle. So we're gonna wait.
But how do you manage to get that through the system, if you like? What do you do if you're in government, if you're in local government and you're in charge of schools? I mean, how do you deal with that? How do you kind of put all of those things in the same box and let them all get what they want?
Yeah, well, that's one of the contradictions with multiculturalism, or the type of multiculturalism we've ended up with. That if you say all lifestyles or beliefs are equal, what do you do when those lifestyles and beliefs contradict?
Yes.
When they're in opposition to each other. I also think there's another interesting problem for the government going forward, that Boris Johnson's got this big majority, 80 odd seats. Labour Party are obviously going to go through a process of internal discussion, get a new leader, and likely to be lagging behind for a little while. But in large swathes of the country, and particularly among what you might call the intelligentsia and the civil service, some of the government departments, some of the people who work in them hold completely different views on these types of issues. And, could Priti Patel, for example, get readily through some of the laws that she's proposing? Could she get support from within the civil service? Look at some of the responses we've had to terrorist attacks in these from these sections of society. They look at their feet. They don't want to grapple with the hard questions.
And this is it. I mean, because there is now, I think, one particular individual who is due to be released on February the 28th, which is not very far away. He's a known terrorist. He's served his time. He's coming up for automatic release. Supposedly, the government is going to legislate before February the 27th to stop that from happening. But are they going to be able to?
Well, I think the government can probably get support in the Commons. It's got a big enough majority, but there'll be very strong advice against it internally, I would imagine. And
someone will say it's illegal, right?
Yeah, and there'll be a legal challenge pretty much straight away. The individual concerned is former shopkeeper from Sunderland, who was convicted, was an Islamic State supporter, but also had also made comments calling for the burning of Shia Muslims. It's often overlooked just how much this hatred is flayed out at all sorts of other different minority groups, including those within Islam. And the government has a choice here, that it can let people out who potentially remain a threat, or it can try get this legislation through and at least send a message out to the public saying, we hear your concern.
Yes, because I think
at the very least we need to have that debate.
Yeah, because I think the public now expect that, because they have heard an awful lot of noise coming from Boris Johnson and from the government since London Bridge happened back in November. We've seen what happened in Streatham. If it happens again, and it's somebody, I mean, obviously you can't guarantee that a terrorist attack won't happen, but certainly if it happens again because of someone who was released, I think that will be a massive problem for this government.
Yeah, they're under pressure. They have set a way forward. I think that's to be commended. And now let's see the government deliver.
Let's see if they can. Dr. Paul Stott, thank you very much indeed. We'll be back with another episode of Off Air next week.